The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass to Catherine.
The decision was already written when Camilla learned what Charles intended to do. There would be no ceremonial warning, no carefully managed palace announcement, and no private compromise to soften the blow. With one signature, the king removed her from Windsor Lodge and transferred control of the residence to Princess Catherine. But the property itself was only the visible part of the story. What Charles signed represented something far deeper, a devastating shift in trust. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla stared at the first page as if someone had placed the wrong file before her. For several seconds, she said nothing. Windsor Lodge was never just another residence in this story. It represented privacy, influence, and closeness to the monarchy's inner circle. The formal transfer, a signed order moving control from one royal household to another, made the message impossible to misunderstand. Her first reaction was disbelief. She asked whether there had been an administrative error, then read the final paragraph again, when the aide confirmed the instruction came directly from Charles. Shock hardened into humiliation. The order did not describe a temporary move. It permanently reassigned the lodge to Catherine, leaving Camilla with no future claim once the transfer was complete. Charles had reached that point in silence. Earlier, he sat alone with the papers while one senior aide waited near the door. He read the final paragraph twice, rested his hand beside the signature line, then set the pen down. The king understood that a residence could be replaced. Trust could not. According to the documented household account created for this dramatized narrative, he finally signed knowing the decision would reach far beyond rooms and keys. Catherine received the news separately and felt no victory. She stayed still as the briefing was explained, then asked whether Camilla had already been told. The princess understood what Windsor Lodge now represented, not a reward, but a painful transfer that could make her appear deeply responsible for another woman's loss. She accepted the information with restraint, yet the unease remained. One detail made the entire decision even more disturbing. The paperwork showed that Charles had started preparing the transfer before Camilla knew any serious dispute existed. That meant the signature was not an angry reaction made in a single difficult moment. It had been considered, prepared, and quietly advanced long before she realized anything was being taken from her. And to understand why the king was willing to make such a personal decision, the story must move beyond the property itself and into the fragile relationships surrounding the crown. Behind the official language were three people facing three completely different fears. Charles was risking the stability of his marriage. Camilla was confronting the possibility that her place beside him no longer guaranteed influence behind palace doors. And Catherine, suddenly placed at the center of the dispute, was being handed something she had never publicly demanded. The Windsor Lodge decision was no longer about bricks, rooms, or royal privilege. It had become personal. Charles understood that every decision involving a royal residence carried a message far beyond the walls themselves. As monarch, he was not simply deciding who lived where. He was showing who stood closest to the future direction of the crown, and that made the transfer impossible to separate from hierarchy. Catherine's growing responsibilities had already made her central to his plans for continuity, meaning the woman receiving Windsor Lodge represented the next chapter of the monarchy, whether she wanted that symbolism or not. Camilla felt the meaning immediately. She sat with a longtime aide and asked a question that sounded more wounded than angry. Was she being slowly removed from decisions that once included her automatically? The queen consort could accept a change of residence. What she struggled to accept was the possibility that the move represented something deeper, that her position beside Charles no longer guaranteed the same influence inside the family. Catherine carried a different burden. William found her standing beside an unopened briefing folder, still unwilling to touch it. The prince watched her for a moment, before saying quietly, "Whatever happens next, this cannot become personal." She finally opened the folder, but her discomfort did not disappear. The future queen told him she did not want Windsor Lodge turned into proof that one woman had defeated another. William listened carefully, because one fact bothered him more than anything else. Charles had deliberately kept him outside the original decision-making process. The king had not asked his son to approve the transfer, defend it, or even prepare Catherine for it. He wanted responsibility to rest with himself alone, and that suggested the decision was more personal than William had first understood. Charles knew exactly why. By keeping the future king away from the initial move, he protected his son from being accused of pushing Camilla aside, while also preventing Catherine from appearing to have demanded anything. Yet that protection carried its own warning. If the monarch was willing to stand alone behind the decision, then something serious had happened before the signature ever appeared. Camilla sensed that hidden history too. Catherine felt it. William now wanted to understand it. And Charles had already decided that the earlier dispute could no longer remain buried. Because the signature did not begin the crisis, it merely exposed a fracture that had already crossed the point of repair. Weeks before the Windsor Lodge papers appeared, one private dinner changed everything. What began as a discussion about future royal duties ended with Charles staring across the table in stunned silence, Catherine leaving earlier than expected, and Camilla refusing to withdraw a demand that had already unsettled the room. Palace tensions had existed before that night. But afterward, according to the logic of this dramatized story, Charles no longer viewed the disagreement as temporary. He viewed it as structural. Charles had spent months trying to hold two priorities together, without allowing either to destroy the other. He wanted Camilla treated with dignity, but he also knew William and Catherine were taking on larger responsibilities that would eventually require more residences, more staff, and greater control over household planning. Those arrangements mattered, because royal households were not simply homes. They were working structures that supported official duties, staff, schedules, and the future shape of the monarchy. Camilla felt that balance shifting against her. During the dinner, she objected directly, when a proposal gave Catherine wider authority over future household arrangements. The Queen Consort then made her position unmistakable. Windsor Lodge, she said, must remain permanently under her control. Catherine immediately tried to lower the temperature, telling the room she was not seeking anyone's home or position. But instead of easing the tension, her words landed badly. Catherine watched the atmosphere harden. She had meant restraint, yet Camilla heard calculation. The older royal questioned whether the future queen's growing responsibilities were becoming an excuse to push others aside. She repeated that security inside the family mattered to her, and the conversation moved from policy into something far more personal. Charles looked at Camilla with visible disappointment. He asked her to stop before the exchange became impossible to repair. The king had spent too long protecting both her place and Catherine's expanding role to watch the discussion collapse into accusations, but she refused to retreat. She told him plainly that this was no longer about scheduling or staff. It was about whether she could trust her position beside him to remain protected. Catherine finally chose silence over another reply. She left earlier than planned, knowing anything more she said would deepen the wound. Charles remained at the table as the doors closed behind her. He folded the briefing paper once, placed it beside his plate, and told Camilla quietly that the conversation had changed how he saw the problem. The following morning, Charles made the move nobody else knew about. Through a documented household request within this dramatized account, he privately asked for every record governing Windsor Lodge's occupancy and transfer authority. In plain terms, he wanted to know exactly who controlled the residence and how that control could legally be reassigned. That request remained hidden until the night when Charles and Camilla finally faced one another without aides, lawyers, or polite royal distance between them. There are arguments that can be repaired, and there are conversations after which nothing returns to what it was. When Camilla finally confronted Charles about Windsor Lodge, she entered believing there was still room to reverse the decision. Instead, she discovered something worse. The transfer had not been written to frighten her into compromise. It had been written because the king had already decided the argument was over. Camilla had requested the meeting herself, after confirming that the transfer order was genuine and permanent. Charles agreed, but he made one condition clear: no senior aides would sit in the room. That mattered, because this would not be handled as a procedural dispute. A transfer order, in simple terms, was the signed instruction changing who controlled the residence. This time, the paperwork was only the surface. The real conflict was personal. Camilla looked directly at Charles and asked the question that had been haunting her since the decision became official. Had Catherine asked for Windsor Lodge? The king answered immediately. No, she had not requested it, demanded it, or pushed him toward it. He told her the decision belonged to him alone, and the firmness of that answer hurt more than any accusation could have. Camilla's anger finally broke through. She accused him of humiliating her so the younger generation could rise more easily. The queen consort believed the transfer made her loss look like Catherine's advancement, and she told him exactly that. Charles did not raise his voice. He answered that Windsor Lodge had stopped being only a residence the moment she turned it into a measure of security and loyalty. The chair moved sharply as Camilla pushed herself backward and stood. She looked ready to leave, but Charles spoke before she reached the door. You already made your choice when you turned this into a test of loyalty. The words stopped her. For a moment, neither moved. The king was not saying that she had chosen to lose the house. He was saying the original argument had forced him to decide whether personal comfort could continue shaping the future of the family. Charles then revealed the details she had not expected. In a private recorded conversation prepared for this dramatized account, he explained that Catherine had suggested another arrangement precisely to avoid this conflict. The princess had not wanted Windsor Lodge to become a symbol of someone else's defeat. He rejected that alternative because he believed leaving the original dispute unresolved would only allow the resentment to return later. Camilla absorbed the revelation, but it did not feel like relief. Catherine had not engineered the decision, yet she would still benefit from it. That truth followed the queen consort as she left the room. For behind Charles's signature stood a structure of royal authority that made one truth unavoidable. The final power had never belonged to either woman. The emotional battle was fierce, but the mechanism behind it was cold. Royal households survive on documents, permissions, property arrangements, and carefully defined authority. And once Charles decided to act, sentiment stopped determining the outcome. The question was no longer whether Camilla wanted Windsor Lodge or whether Catherine felt comfortable accepting it. The question became brutally simple. Who possessed the authority to decide? In this dramatized royal conflict, the answer rested with the king. Charles reviewed the final wording with a senior household official and asked one question before anything moved forward. Could Camilla's dignity be protected without weakening the decision itself? A sovereign household decision, in simple terms, was an instruction made under the monarch's authority about how royal residences and household responsibilities would be managed. In this case, that authority allowed him to reassign both occupancy and administrative control of Windsor Lodge. The answer he received was uncomfortable. If the language remained vague, the transfer could be challenged emotionally or interpreted as temporary later. Charles sat with that possibility for several seconds before choosing clarity over comfort. The king understood the cost. He also understood that leaving room for another dispute would only return everyone to the same conflict months later. He instructed the official to leave the order exactly as written. Catherine faced the consequences from a different position. She was shown the relevant page and immediately asked whether her name could be removed until Camilla had been informed personally. The princess was not the architect of the move. She had no independent power to remove another royal from the residence or assign the property to herself. She was the beneficiary of Charles's decision, and that difference mattered because it placed responsibility firmly on him. Catherine's request came too late. The signature was already there. She read the wording again and realized the transfer gave her more than permission to use Windsor Lodge. It placed responsibility for its future household function under her control, tying the residence to a wider plan for the next generation. The future queen understood that this was why the decision carried such weight. A home was becoming part of the monarchy's long-term structure. Charles knew the same thing. By signing, he had shifted more than keys and rooms. He had drawn a line between the present household and the one expected to carry greater responsibility in the years ahead. That made the order powerful, but it also made the personal damage harder to contain. Within hours, Camilla's staff received the first practical instructions connected to the transfer. Lists were prepared, timelines were discussed, personal belongings would have to be separated from household property. And once the decision moved from paper into real rooms, real possessions, and real departures, the emotional cost could no longer be hidden behind palace language. The most painful moment was not the argument. It was the morning afterward, when the decision became ordinary and practical. Boxes appeared. Staff received new instructions. Keys had to be accounted for. Rooms that had once felt permanent suddenly belonged to a future that no longer included Camilla in the same way. For the first time since Charles signed the order, the consequences were no longer theoretical. Windsor Lodge had begun moving on without her. Camilla walked into one of the sitting rooms and stopped when she saw two labeled packing cases beside a cabinet. For a moment, the queen consort simply stared at them. Household staff had already received a timetable for transferring personal belongings and administrative control, meaning responsibility for the residence was now moving step by step from one royal household to another. That mattered because every list, key, and packed object made the loss permanent in a way the signed document never could. Her voice came quickly. She told an aide to stop packing. The room went still. Then, only seconds later, Camilla looked back at the cases and changed her mind. "Continue," she said quietly. The anger had not disappeared, but something inside her had shifted. Fighting over every possession would not restore what Charles had already taken away. Charles heard that preparations had begun and almost went to see her. The king asked whether she was alone, then paused when told staff were still moving through the residence. He considered going anyway, but decided against it. He knew his presence could turn a painful departure into another confrontation, and for once, distance felt less cruel than another argument neither of them could win. Camilla eventually returned to her desk, where one set of keys remained beside a handwritten household list. She picked them up and held them longer than necessary. Those keys had once represented privacy and certainty. Now they represented an ending. Without calling anyone into the room, she placed them beside the list and walked away. Catherine, meanwhile, refused to treat the transfer like a victory. She instructed her household not to redecorate, move furniture, or make immediate changes. The princess then sent a private written message through her personal office, saying she would not formally enter Windsor Lodge until Camilla's departure was complete. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. For the first time, compassion began separating itself from the machinery of the decision. Camilla read the message alone. Her first reaction was not anger. She read it again, then asked whether Catherine had written it herself. When told yes, the queen consort became unexpectedly quiet. Because when the two women were finally stripped of courtiers, documents, and assumptions, The conflict changed in a way neither Charles nor William had predicted. No lawyers stood between them. No palace officials explained what either woman was supposed to say. When Catherine and Camilla finally met privately, Windsor Lodge was already lost as a practical question. What remained was far more difficult: whether the transfer would permanently define their relationship. Catherine entered, expecting anger. Camilla entered, expecting justification. Instead, the conversation forced both women to confront a truth the palace machinery had obscured. The decision belonged to Charles, but its emotional consequences belonged to them. Catherine had asked for the meeting before formally taking responsibility for the property. Camilla agreed, but only if no aides were present. That condition mattered, because aides normally act as a protective layer in sensitive royal meetings, carrying messages and keeping difficult exchanges controlled. Without them, there would be no buffer, no careful wording prepared by someone else. Just two women facing the consequences directly. Catherine spoke first. She told Camilla clearly that she had never asked Charles for Windsor Lodge. The princess also explained that she had suggested another arrangement because she feared the residence would become a public symbol of one woman replacing another. She did not want a house to be treated as proof that her future role required somebody else's humiliation. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then, for the first time, the queen consort admitted what had driven much of her anger. She had begun to believe that Catherine's growing prominence meant someone else had to lose ground for the future queen to rise. Every new responsibility, every change in household planning, every shift toward the next generation had started to feel personal. She had treated that fear as evidence long before anyone had actually said she was being replaced. Silence settled between them. Camilla reached for the remaining lodge key and placed it on the table. She did not leave it with a secretary or household official. She pushed it slowly toward Catherine herself. The princess looked at it, but did not immediately touch it. That hesitation mattered more than any speech. She understood what the key had come to represent. Catherine finally told her she would accept the king's decision, but she would never use Windsor Lodge as proof that she had defeated another royal woman. She would not celebrate the transfer, and she would not allow her household to treat it like a conquest. Camilla held her gaze for a long moment. Then she gave the first sign that resistance was ending. "Then make certain that is what people see," she said quietly. The private battle had finally softened, but outside Windsor, the story was about to become something much larger than a family disagreement. By morning, the secret belonged to everyone. What had unfolded through private meetings and closed doors suddenly became a national spectacle, reduced to a few explosive words. Camilla out, Catherine in. Commentators searched for winners and losers. Crowds gathered. Every gesture was examined for hidden meaning, yet the public reaction revealed something the palace itself had struggled to articulate. The transfer was being interpreted not simply as domestic conflict, but as a statement about the monarchy's future. Charles watched the coverage in silence. The king had intended the transfer as a private decision about household authority. But the public saw something much larger. A royal household, in simple terms, was the network of residences, staff, duties, and resources supporting a senior member of the family. Moving Windsor Lodge from Camilla to Catherine therefore looked less like a change of address and more like a visible shift in who represented the monarchy's next chapter. The palace answered carefully. Staff released a restrained confirmation acknowledging that control of the residence had changed, but they refused to describe the move as punishment. That wording did little to calm the reaction. Broadcasters framed the story as an extraordinary redistribution of status, and the very restraint of the statement made the decision feel even more serious. Catherine felt the pressure immediately. She told William that she would not allow herself to be shown celebrating another woman's humiliation. The princess feared that every future appearance connected with Windsor Lodge would be turned into a victory image. The prince understood the danger. If the public reduced the story to winners and losers, the private understanding reached with Camilla could collapse under the weight of spectacle. Outside Windsor Castle, the drama became impossible to contain. Crowds gathered beneath television cameras, while one national newspaper appeared, with Catherine dominating the front page beneath the fictional headline, "The Keys to the Future." The image captured the public mood in a single phrase. People were no longer discussing only a house. They were discussing succession, influence, and whether Charles had deliberately moved the monarchy closer to William and Catherine. Then the tone shifted. One broadcaster highlighted Catherine's decision not to enter Windsor Lodge until Camilla's departure was fully complete. That detail changed part of the conversation. What had looked like triumph began to look more like restraint. The future queen had gained responsibility, but she had refused to turn another woman's loss into celebration. Charles noticed that shift too. Camilla heard it. Catherine felt the burden of it. And by evening, Windsor Lodge had become a symbol none of them could completely control. The answer would not come from another document, another headline, or another confrontation. It would come from what Charles, Camilla, and Catherine chose to do once the noise finally faded. In the end, Windsor Lodge was never merely a house. It became the place where a marriage encountered the limits of loyalty, where a future queen learned the cost of inheritance, and where a king decided that preserving peace could no longer mean postponing difficult choices. Charles's signature wounded Camilla, burdened Catherine, and exposed tensions the family had tried to manage quietly. But when the doors finally closed behind the dispute, one truth remained. The monarchy had chosen direction over comfort. Catherine accepted responsibility only after Camilla's belongings were gone and the private handover was complete. She entered without celebration, accompanied by William, and made one thing clear from the beginning: Windsor Lodge would not become a trophy. The residence would serve family continuity and future duty. In simple terms, that meant the house would support the working responsibilities of the next generation, rather than stand as proof that one royal woman had defeated another. Charles kept the transfer exactly as signed. The king refused to soften the wording or reopen the arrangement, confirming that the decision had never been an emotional threat designed to force Camilla into submission. It was a deliberate restructuring of the family's future. That choice mattered, because reversing it would have turned every painful conversation into meaningless theater. He had accepted responsibility for the consequences, and now he intended to live with them. Camilla finally stopped fighting. The queen consort understood that continued resistance would define her more than the loss itself. Windsor Lodge was gone, but dignity did not have to disappear with it. She accepted the outcome without reclaiming the residence, and in doing so, she prevented bitterness from becoming the final image attached to her role in the conflict. Catherine later met Charles privately. The old lodge key still rested untouched on a table between them. He noticed it immediately. The monarch told her quietly that authority mattered most when it was exercised without cruelty. She did not answer at once. Only after he left did the future queen close her hand around the key, accepting not victory, but responsibility. That moment captured the real verdict. Charles remained personally committed to Camilla, but he had drawn a permanent boundary between marriage and the future structure of the monarchy. Catherine gained authority without turning it into conquest. William stood beside her without claiming credit for a decision he had never engineered. And the king accepted the pain his choice caused, rather than hiding behind palace machinery. There is no next battle required to explain this moment. The signature stood. The handover was completed, and Windsor Lodge became the clearest symbol yet that Charles had chosen the future of the crown, even when that choice came at a deeply personal cost. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.